as we jump in. So thank you for coming tonight for our Real Talk, Creating Healthy Conversations with Young People. My name is Carrie Archer. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the manager of education and outreach at Planned Parenthood of Illinois. I've been teaching sexual health education for about 10 years now. So really excited though. I love getting to talk to adults who are coming to spaces to really learn or get more comfortable or confident talking to young people about the wide variety of sexual health, sex, and sexuality topics. So really looking forward to our discussion tonight, our chat about things as we engage as a group. So looking forward to it. A couple things that are specific, as I just mentioned, your microphones are muted on my end, and then also cameras are off for the reason of just, if a mic accidentally gets turned on, or if just with the public nature of this being open to the public, cameras being off. So to avoid any chance of someone deciding to be disruptive. So we're just creating that space. Now, if you do have questions, you have things you want to comment on, feel free to chat. All of the chat is also sent directly to me. I can reach out to all of you, but you cannot reach out to the whole group. So if you are concerned about anonymity or you have a question you just want to put in front of the group, feel free to ask. There are a couple built-in spaces to talk or to answer some questions, because you may have things you want a little more detail about. So feel free to ask. Now, within this, some guidelines: take care of yourself. There aren't any built-in breaks. We have about an hour together, so there's no built-in breaks. So take the space you need. I hope you're open to some new tactics, some new techniques, information. Like I said, I've been teaching sexual health education for about 10 years. I've been in a lot of spaces with a lot of different age groups. So these are a lot of best practices that I know work talking to young people about a variety of sexual health topics. This is a no judgment space. So whether you're a parent who's here, you're a guardian, you're another adult who has young people in their life, maybe you're a mentor or a coach or a teacher yourself, and you want to know how you have these conversations in a way that really is healthy and positive and uplifts and strengthens young people's ability to make best decisions for themselves, be respectful of each other, create positive spaces for them and the people in their lives. Wherever you're at, hopefully you'll walk away a little more confident to talk about sex, sexuality, and sexual health today. And then, like I mentioned, feel free to ask questions. Again, if you just joined us, that is via the chat. Those messages will go directly to me. Now, our goals, or the things we're kind of the main chunks of things we'll talk about, we're going to explore this idea of this sort of societal notion of the talk and why it's very limiting if we only view kind of discussing sex, sexuality, and sexual health with young people as like this one-off discussion. We're going to talk about some concepts of sexuality when we think about sort of the umbrella or the topics we want to be able to focus on or discuss with young people. What does that look like? Reflect on some personal values, or at least consider the importance of understanding or reflecting on our personal values and how that affects our communication when we discuss things with young people. So that's teenagers and also children. And then think about some of the healthy ways to approach discussion. So kind of those best practices about discussion. As we go forward. Now, we're not going to be able to give you, the ability to be prepared for every topic, but we can give you the tools to really think about when questions come up. There are moments that might feel awkward, but how can we make that into a supportive conversation, or a conversation that allows us to interact with a young person in a way that empowers them to continue the conversation or to make healthier choices for themselves, for the young people in our lives. That's our overall goal. Now I'm going to ask you really quick, I do want to get a sense kind of our group. We've got a nice sized group here if you're on and you're able to. If not, no worries, but I'm going to post a real quick poll. It's got 2 questions. It's going to ask you to answer with one answer for each. So you might have to decide between like, oh, I'm kind of 50-50. you're going to have to kind of decide on one and just choose for yourself the best answer for it. So I'm going to give a minute here for answers. The first question is, as a child, I learned most of my information about sex, sexuality, and sexual health from, and then a variety of options: parents, guardians, siblings, cousins, school, friends, media, other trusted adults. As a teenager, I learned most of my information about sex, sexuality, and sexual health from parents, guardians, the same list. So kind of who were you going to? If you can think back to those younger years, it might be a little bit of a blur. I know I feel that way a lot when I get asked by students what my experiences were. Sometimes I'm not really that sure anymore. Appreciate getting a lot of answers. We'll take about another 20 seconds or so to get some. And then if you click it, yep, so we got excellent. We got a good chunk around that. Wonderful. And I'm not seeing anything else coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and end it here in about 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Oh, appreciate for those of you who put who drops down those elements. If you put it in the chat, that's a good way for me to get it as well. So if we take a peek kind of at our results here, we can see for younger people, it looks like some friends, school, parents, guardians. And then if we go down, only 2 categories are popping up. So it's a very unique, and we'll talk about why that is and how we as adults can shift some of our lens about approaching conversations, depending on the age group we're interacting with. So that allows us to really be more prepared, because of course what teenagers want to talk about or might need to be nudged into talking about is going to be very different than younger kids as well. But for most young people, having trusted adults, having people in their lives to go to talk about different topics within sex, sexuality, and sexual health is a main source of information. They might not get all of their information. In fact, they might find it's difficult, but generally they want to get that information from some level of trusted adult. And we'll talk about, as the adults, how can we become the adult who is opening the door to those conversations and giving the space to young people, even if it doesn't seem like they're as interested, because in my experience working and interacting with a lot of them, they really are looking for the information. So let's go ahead and discuss a little bit this first thing, which is this notion of the talk. It's time for the talk, which really often is presented, if we think about especially media, TV, movies, it's presented in a very limited way. We're thinking about this idea that a parent generally sits down on the bed or the couch with a young person. Maybe they've pulled them out of some other activity they're doing, and they just say, it's time for the talk. It's usually about reproduction or about the birds and the bees or some other euphemism for it. And it generally presents the adult in one of 2 ways. They're either super confident, they're the authority figure. It's that standard, like, this is wisdom I'm imparting on you, so listen up, and this is the one time we'll talk about it. And when I walk away, it's all clear and we're good to go. Or it's really played for laughs. You're looking at this idea that somebody is, this sort of sense that like the parent's totally going to be unprepared. They're going to be so nervous. They're going to trip over their words. There's usually some sort of like double entendre or euphemism thrown in that the parent, didn't realize they were going to make, and that makes everything awkward. The young person's really awkward. But these are just myths about what it actually looks like or feels like to have conversations with young people. So it's a very limiting way to consider it, but it's a common theme that we hear young people talk about. Or if you talk to adults and they say, oh, that was kind of what my experience was this one talk and that was it. And we didn't talk about it anymore in my household growing up or with my family growing up. And it creates some problematic myths. And one of them is this idea that there's the one and only talk. The talk is one and done. It's have it, it's done. We want to shift that mindset. So if you're here tonight, one thing to really consider is that it's a series of talks. It's a series of mini discussions, and it's often not planned. It's usually when a young person hears something at school and they ask about it. Or I have a friend who their 8-year-old asked the pastor what a virgin was because they were talking about the Virgin Mary in church. And so my friend got to drive home discussing what a virgin was and trying to have that discussion, or white knuckle at home and be like sweating because they didn't really know how to handle it. So it's a lot of mini discussions. It's times when the adult isn't prepared, but they know the conversation is very important. And it's back and forth as opposed to just the adult speaks at the young person without hearing their opinions, their values, the knowledge they already have. We want to not think about the talk at, we want to think about the discussion between. So, and it becomes that back and forth. And then it's a space to create clarity as opposed to, we had the talk, let's never speak of it again, both walk away. And then the young person goes, as we saw in our poll, to their friends to be like, okay, let's try to patch it all together. You know a little bit, I know a little bit. Maybe the movie we watched knew a little bit. Maybe we can figure this out together. Whereas we want to get to a place where one talk may end and then clarity later on comes from more conversations, keeping that conversation going, having that door open for more conversations. Now it can cause nerves thinking about, oh, it has to be a lot of discussions. A lot of times we build up the one talk, which makes it so scary that people never have it. But it can be also kind of like, well, what if I have a lot of mini discussions and they don't really go that well? That is likely to happen. Or certain topics might go really well. You feel super confident as the adult in the space talking about how to, have a good friendship or a good relationship, but you don't feel prepared at all to talk about birth control options with a young person or to talk about their identity as they are figuring out their identity. It's okay. And each of us are going to be at a different place, and that's all right too. The effort goes a long way. It shows young people a willingness and someone they can trust to have conversations with, because those conversations are going to happen over and over, because sexuality is a wide range of topics. And when we think about that, we're thinking about the fact that sexuality and identity are developed throughout our lives. Each individual person develops their own elements around their sexuality, their identity, their values as they develop them, as they shift, their beliefs, their behaviors. Those things are going to shift throughout. And so that's why it's so important these conversations are happening consistently. Now, I've mentioned this, but it's important to think as well that even if you're at a place where maybe you're not having those conversations with the young people in your lives up to this point, it's okay. I'm not saying that, oh, if you missed the first conversations when children were younger, they can't start in the teenage years. In fact, any time to start is a great time to start. So hopefully this will also prepare you maybe to start those conversations. And sexuality is complicated, and that can make it, and it's broad, which can also make it tough. I wanted to give you all an easily accessible tool. These are called the circles of sexuality. They're really easy to Google or search for online. You can find all kinds of beautiful versions of them. I think they're a really good resource just to get a sense of how many things fall under sexuality that we often overlook. Because with adults, I think it's also important to know that if you have children, if you have young people in your life, you've probably had some conversations about more types of things that are under the umbrella of sexuality than you even think about. So if we take intimacy here, this is about being emotionally close with people, someone's boundaries about emotional closeness. This is about liking, feeling love for someone. So if you ever had a conversation with a young person about what it means to be a good friend and like someone and reciprocate in a relationship, you've had a conversation about intimacy. You might not have called it those terms, but you've had it. So sexual health and reproduction is just about, everything that has to do with healthcare, has to do with about decisions about raising a child, pregnancy, STIs, sexually transmitted infections. birth control, any of those topics, just about anatomy. So providing young people with the correct terms for their body parts. That is having a conversation with them about anatomy and about sexual health and reproduction. So those are some elements. Power and sexualization, that has to do with some of the really unhealthy sides of sexuality. So when we think about it, these often, in my experience talking with adults, are some of the more difficult topics to discuss. So I did want to highlight it, but it's things about abuse. It's things about unhealthy relationship dynamics, sexual assault, sexual harassment. And those can be tough conversations to have, but they're also really important conversations to have for young people to be able to get support, to be safe as they develop and they grow older. And that is a really good example of the conversations we have with children are different than teenagers. I think about it in terms of, when a teenager is getting their first job, an example I like to use, I guess, is we want to talk to them about proper, healthy workplace practices, including safety around their boss, that it's not okay for their boss to make inappropriate jokes or their coworkers to make inappropriate jokes. That is teaching them about power and sexualization. So these are conversations that I think a lot of times people know are important, but they also don't really associate them with being sexuality talks. So why I say that is just to let adults know you probably have a lot of the tools and a lot of the experience to have conversations already. And that means you have some base to really be able to continue these conversations. And the other thing is you don't need to be an expert. I think that is a big barrier for a lot of adults that I always want to bring up is you don't need to know everything about every topic to be able to support a young person and have a conversation, help develop their comfort around talking about things. So we see some examples here. You don't need to know every LGBTQIA term to show support as a young person is discovering their identities and using terminology to describe themselves and show support about who they are. You don't have to know everything about birth control to help a young person access healthcare. You don't need to be on every social media site. I'm on none of them, but I still get to the privilege of talking to young people about how to be safe online and how to be respectful online. And then you don't have to be in a perfect relationship. Nobody is, in order to discuss kind of healthy relationships and what you want for the young people in their life, in order to be respected, in order to be safe in their relationships. So expertise gets thrown around a lot. It is a myth when it comes to the ability of really having consistent conversations. Now, going and getting other resources, that's a great tool. That's a great way to connect to a young person, but also help them access information. But someone does not need to know everything about every topic to be able to have these conversations. So get rid of this notion of the talk and this expertise, because the other big thing is that's kind of a lie of the talk is this idea of the perfect age and this idea that, okay, a conversation has to happen when this teenager turns this age, or they're this exact thing, or they've experienced this exact thing. We want to have conversations with young people to prepare them for things that may happen one day, so they know how to handle that situation. And so we want to be able to start conversations as young as we can in order to make those conversations comfortable. Now, having said that, I want to reiterate, if you have not started conversations, if you're here because this is an attempt or a time for you to feel more comfortable or to take some best practices to start the conversation, that's perfectly fine too. Just because someone didn't maybe have a conversation when the young person in their life was younger doesn't mean they can't start now, and it's not going to have a lot of benefits for their interactions. Because as young people develop, kind of what they talk about is going to really shift. And again, we can't talk about every topic and every situation and every age, but to give you kind of some sense of what some of the key elements look like when having conversations with young people, there are a couple categories we can think about. So children, prepubescent children, so think kind of 9 and under is a kind of a good age range. We're talking about a few major categories. We're talking about the fact that young children are curious about their bodies. They're looking, they're exploring their bodies. They compare their bodies to other kids. A lot of times adults will think like, oh, if two kids are, both asking about each other's body, there's some sexual element. That is not the case. It's just curiosity. It has nothing to do with anything around sexuality when it comes to like sexual attraction. It's just curiosity. They're curious about reproduction. I have a colleague who was in a Zoom call, and that was when their daughter came in and was like, where do kittens come from? That was, of course, for the young person, the perfect time to be like, I gotta know, where are kittens coming from? So they're curious about reproduction. A perfect example of the talk doesn't happen in this perfect setting. So, but that's a good example of a way to use a question to talk about things, right? So being able to talk about parts of the body, learning accurate terminology or medically accurate terminology. It's okay for a child to know that some people have penises, some people have vaginas, body parts have functions. So understanding that, they're curious about gender, they're curious about, what it means to be for kids, a boy, a girl. They're thinking about it in terms of those very rigid thought patterns around a binary. So having a conversation with a young child, but recognizing that, people are different, and we're talking about things like being respectful of other people. So there's a lot of current things happening about how do you talk to young kids about gender identity? How do you bring up these topics? And it's very different than how teenagers learn about and discuss it. So those are elements that are very different within the space, but young kids are certainly looking to talk about gender. So what does that look like for like sexual education? I mentioned correct names of body parts, but also we talk about things like safe touch and unsafe touch, letting young kids know that if someone is touching them in a way that does not feel comfortable, they should talk to a trusted adult. We're talking about consent, even though we're not using the terms consent with young people. We're talking about, if you hug someone and they push you away, or they say they don't want to be hugged, respect that. So we're not talking about consent in the way we talk about with older kids, but we're setting the foundation of these conversations. And then one final one that I personally always am trying to get up on the soapbox and talk about with parents is talking about puberty before puberty starts. And that is those later elementary years, thinking about 7, 8, 9-year-olds, because what tends to happen is people talk about puberty with young people after they've already started experiencing it. So the sooner someone can talk about it to prepare them, the more prepared and ready for those bodily changes they'll be. Now, those conversations then look a lot different for post-puberty, because preteens and teenagers, what they're concerned with, what they're talking about is very different. They have an awareness of their body that is different. They're comparing in different ways. They start to compare to little kids tend not to have any sense of, body image issues. Like they'll run around naked wherever. There's all these societal messages, though, that teenagers, preteens are hearing. So they're exploring that and experiencing that differently. So having conversations around that all bodies are going to be different. Their development's going to be different than the other people in their class. And that's an okay thing. Different bodies are good. All bodies are good. So thinking about that, their identities are shifting. They might not have the terminology to explain or express their identity. They might discover a term that fits them well. So they might want to be referred to that. That may change for them as they explore and discover more about themselves. For other kids, it's going to be slightly more rigid, where they have terminology from a younger age, and that is how they express themselves and the identity terms they use for themselves. Awareness of sexual media, they're looking for peer approval a lot. We saw that in our poll earlier. People was media peers once they got into the teenage years. Now, the one thing that I think is really important then, and when you think about having conversations, there's actually this unique sort of feedback loop, or maybe it's a paradox of the ages where it's a more adult driven to get to conversations around sex and sexuality because of the peer group becoming more important in the teenage years, which is very common. It often is the adult who has to drive the conversations or try to broach conversations more than with kids. It often feels like, oh, if they're teenagers, if they have questions, they know they can come to us as adults, they can vocalize their questions, they have the vocabulary for it, it's better. But in truth, they often are at a place where they want to talk to adults in their lives, and they might, for many individuals in the room, you might have the relationships where you're having these conversations a lot. But it also could be that because of where they're at and they're looking to their peers for a lot more, the adults in their lives kind of have to pry a little bit more. They have to be willing to try to start the conversation more than with younger kids. So it kind of feels like teenagers should come because they're older and they know what they want to talk about, but they're also pulled away more because of this sense of wanting peer approval, more independence, whatever it looks like, maybe not feeling comfortable because they are experiencing so many new things. So the teenage years, the preteen years, those puberty years really are prime time for adults to be driving the attempts to get the conversation started. And those look a little bit different as young people evolve. Now, I wanted to leave a little space if there were any questions within the chat here. I don't see any. If there's any questions and you'd like to throw them in the chat, I would love to get them. But we'll keep moving if nothing's popped up yet. And then I'll leave space at the end too, where we can also do, I'll be able to unmute if people want to ask, because I know sometimes it's hard to type out a question. So I appreciate the patience with that. All right, let's keep rocking. Now, we talked about the talk and why that is very limiting and how we can consider having multiple conversations. Now, this next piece is just kind of looking a little bit at how, as adults, we can reflect on some things that affect how we communicate. And sorry, I got one. Yeah, so this will be online. It'll get sent out a recording. So if you do have to leave, if that's necessary, feel free. I will make sure it gets to everyone who showed up as well. So very good question. Hopefully I won't see a mass exodus now, but I know that happens sometimes. I know life gets in the way of 6 to 7 o'clock discussions. So it happens. But as we think as well, the reason I want us to take some time to just kind of think about reflecting on values is to think about how just your personal values are going to affect your communication with young people. So how are those things, how is it going to make it, what things are difficult to talk about, but also what do you really want to make sure you're sharing with the young people in your life? Now, this can be difficult if you're a teacher, right? Teaching sex ed or teaching or discussing these things. There's a lot of limits on going into discussing values. When I go teach sex ed, I don't just go in and share my values and my beliefs about things because it's a much more neutral space. I'm there to provide information and build skills and to help young people reflect on their values. So it really is a privilege if you're a parent, a guardian, a mentor, to be able to really help young people develop their values, because that is one thing that when they're asking questions, they're looking for information, but they're also looking to develop how others see the world so they can figure out how they want to see the world. So that goes a long way into it. Now, values, though, really, they shift, they change over time, of course. As adults, they tend to get more rigid. Young people, their values change very fluidly. They're influenced by people in their lives. I see this a lot because on a Monday, I'll hear a student say one thing. On a Wednesday, they say something else. And I found out on Tuesday, oh, it's because they had a talk with the person they're dating about this topic and that person totally changed their mind. So it's these elements around values is shifting. When we talk about it and think about the conversations we're having, these elements around what is it right and wrong, and what is it that makes something normal? Because when we talk about this, a lot of the messaging that young people are looking for is this sense about what is normal? Am I normal? What should I view as normal? And our values really shape that, and also what an adult is willing to talk to a young person about. So our values affect how we communicate. So as an example, right, a child might come and they ask, why someone watch porn? This is a question I get a lot in middle school spaces. Middle schoolers often aren't seeking out sexually explicit material, but they've heard about it, or their peer, or maybe an older sibling specifically might have seen it or talked about it. So they're often curious, but they have no interest in it. So a common question is like, why would somebody want to engage with that media? They don't say it in that way. They use kid language, more like, why would anyone do that? It's gross. And so if a parent's values are to respond with like, well, people who do that, they're lonely. That's a very limited answer. It's an answer that is saying, and is shaping some level of value in a young person to say, oh, someone who does this is a lonely person. And then a lonely person, if they might think, and that means they're a sad person. So depending on someone's values around things, it really will shape the conversation they're having. And it might really limit the conversation. It might put a value in a young person that, again, gets them to experience or think about individuals in a certain way. So thinking about what your values are and how they might limit the conversation is important. And then also, how are you receiving information? So, are you respecting the person who's bringing it? Does the information go against your personal values? Our example here is, a parent responds to a young person who is identifying as bisexual. They are having a sense of their attraction. Bisexual is a type of sexual identity. And, for some adults, their values might be that young people don't really have any sense of their identity. It's just a phase. This term is not something that's really real to who they are. And that will affect how they respond to that, or how much they're willing to support or respect the young person's identity choices, or their choice of term for their identity, I should say. So, and then also, is it a 10-year-old versus 16-year-old? Our values around age and identity affect that. Our values around gender affect that. I hear a lot of young people who have heard the messaging that someone who identifies as a boy or a man can't be bisexual. That person's actually gay. That's a value statement. That is not a truthful statement. It's a value statement. So how and where that messaging comes from really is affected by our values. So considering how those values are taking shape is very important, because we also want to consider, are our values being portrayed as facts as opposed to just being values? So a lot of things that are values for us as individuals become so ingrained that we view them as being facts when they are in fact values. So you've got, for example, a question like, when is someone ready to lose their virginity? I get a lot of questions, and I know adults get a lot of questions, because young people are really, once they hear this term, they have a sense of it. They're thinking about behavior. They're getting maybe interested in sexual behavior. They want to have a sense of what it means to engage in sexual activity and what it means for them as individuals. So the truth is, there is no exact behavior that is associated with virginity. It's subjective, it's a value, but a lot of people view it as a very straightforward fact. A lot of people will say, oh no, what sex is a fact. It's this behavior, but it is different depending on the individual. So a factual statement would cover that virginity is different for each person. There's no one exact time someone's ready for sexual activity. And it allows to expand into a discussion around what someone might want to do to be prepared to start engaging in sexual activity, such as consent, trusting their partner, being safe. So that opens up a door. But a lot of times, young people will be curious about something and adults will share a value as a fact and then not provide more context or information. So we want to really also think, how can we provide both factual information, but also values in the space? So as we go, we've got these elements here around now creating healthy discussions. I've got a couple in the chat. I just wanted to go. Resources like this that you all share from your programming in non-Zoom format as recording user gates, but also curious about teach-ins to larger communities. There are other resources we can connect about it that would be more like written resources, things like that. Part of this for attending, I will share out some really good resources about having conversations and things that can be used for larger communities as a part of it. So that's a very good question, because I know not everyone has an hour to watch a full session like this. Now, I would like, because I've chatted for a while about some of the key elements to consider when talking, but each person is going to be at a different place. So I am curious if you are comfortable. Again, the chats are going to come to me and then I will share out. What is a barrier for you? Think about a barrier that you think you would like to be more confident or know how to overcome, that either in the past or is currently making it feel difficult for you to have conversations about sex, sexuality, or sexual health with a young person in your life. So in the chat would be great. I'd love to hear a few answers about kind of a sense of what makes it difficult for you to have conversations with young people currently or in the past. All right, got one already. Appreciate it. Love to hear more. All right, so I've got child's not receptive to talking, struggle with educating because it seems like it's condoning early sexual activity. Both very common barriers that I hear. Any others? Got a couple, but I know we're a pretty big group. I'd love to hear some others. And it could be, it doesn't have to be like it could be within a classroom space if you're a teacher who's on the call. All right, so the political tightrope of being in a school authority, educating sexual health, let alone exploring gender and sexuality. Certainly there are roadblocks to that make it difficult. And it's very difficult having the conversation with, a family member that's a young person. It looks so different than having that conversation in a school setting. So very, very true. Got a few. I appreciate it. Anybody else in the chat? All right. So appreciate the answers. If you didn't get a chance or just didn't want to answer, no worries at all. Again, it's your space. So happy to get a few. We'll talk a little bit about barriers, but I wanted to get a sense and just, those are common ones I see come up. And when we think about how do we have these discussions, the next thing I want everyone to be able to walk away with are just some pretty straightforward tools or things to consider about having the conversation. So what can someone do in the space? Oh, got one more. Father discussing with daughter. Yes, certainly the gender dynamic comes up a lot about it, especially it's hard, if somebody is experienced a very different developmental period, they experience things very differently, it can be difficult to then have that conversation. So a couple things to consider, right, is how do we actually start these conversations? Because that's a common barrier too. And this goes to that idea, right, of maybe someone's not receptive. Maybe they don't really want to have the conversation. It goes to maybe it's because it never feels like the right time or a good time. And I just want to re-stress any chance to try the conversation will start to pay off. It really is in many ways a snowball effect. And a few times to really get in and be engaged can be what's happening in life. Again, with a lot of the messaging we get about when we should be talking to young people is that it should be like after a large event in their life or after something already occurred. You know, this idea of, oh, talk to a person who has a period after their first period, as opposed to knowing how to bring it up prior to them ever having one. So how can somebody really spark changes? So it could be developmental changes in the body for young kids, for kids who are about to start going through puberty or are. It could be anything that is noticed. It could be even changes in how they are starting to present themselves. It can be, you know, you noticed a young person put their shirt on with pairing of clothes they never have, and you want to have a conversation about how they're feeling about themselves and how they're presenting themselves. That's a conversation starter. It could be family events. These are really, really good ways when, you know, something's happening in the family. It doesn't even have to be the family that lives under one household. It could be the extended family. That is a way, because people know those individuals, or they tend to know them. You know, somebody's pregnant in the family. Good example of a way to talk with young people about pregnancy. Somebody is having a breakup in the family. Good way to talk about what it means to have a relationship. There are many, many opportunities within life. A really, really good one is school moments. So little bits and pieces about what's going on in school goes a long way. So young person comes home and they say, oh, I'm so frustrated with their friend. They always put their arm around me in the mornings and it really annoys me. Perfect way to talk about personal boundaries, about what it means to be a friend, about the potential what does it mean if someone's experiencing attraction, but they don't experience it back. There are so many things that can come from that one statement. And school moments also help with the piece about if a young person's not receptive, because that is something they are existing in. Of course, not every young person is dying to talk about school with the adults in their life who are outside of it. It can be a very stressful environment, but it's also something that often they are looking for support about. Even if they like going to school, there are things they want and need support about when it comes to it. And that can be a really good way to talk in a way that about things that they may be a little bit more receptive about. And it doesn't have to be this like, I want to have this conversation. It can be so-and-so are dating, and can you believe what one of the partners did? Then it's less awkward because it's not an adult talking about that young person's dating relationship. They're talking about relationships in general. So there are lots of things within school moments to discuss that can come up. And then one that goes a really long way, and this is, you know, going to set up a young person, is talk about, you know, media or current events. Watching a show together, seeing something on the news, maybe there's something they bring up that you overhear that's happening on TikTok or social media, and it's a way to get them talking about something they're interested in, and then asking them questions about their thoughts around some things. So for example, you know, if using media to spark a conversation can look like they're watching a show and two people are in a romantic relationship. There are some questions that can be asked just to bring that up. There are things you can talk about. What do you want for them in their romantic relationships? relationships you've had if you want to. Young people really do want to know about the experiences of the adults in their lives. It helps them shape a sense of, again, normalcy, because it's like other people have experienced this, or also their values, to get a sense around that. So being able to have that discussion from what the media is using as a bridge to get there can go a really long way. So I see this with video games. This is a way, I'll put myself out there a little bit, that I've used to talk to my older nephew, who's a sophomore in high school. Video games have a lot of imagery. They have a lot of portrayals of how people should look, of how people should be treated. And so that's been a way for me to talk to him about respect. It's been a way to talk about treatment of individuals. Even those conversations can come from something that when we're playing a video game, all of a sudden I'm just nudging him into more and more of his thoughts. So that's an example of using those media, using that space. Lyrics to a song in the car, something is mentioned about relationships, about sex, about sexuality. That's a way to bridge the conversation, start the conversation in a way that's going to be inclusive of things that they may already be interested in, and it allows them into that space. Now, some practices here, approaching discussions. If you're having it, then you can certainly use and work with some of these. So these are just kind of in general terms. If you're having it, validate them, be happy you're having, let them know you're excited, even if you're not that excited, you're nervous maybe, to have the conversation, or that you're excited that they are willing to talk to you about this topic, whatever it may be. Stay calm and positive. Feel free to share. I've mentioned sharing. That is very much your choice as an adult of what you feel comfortable sharing. You know, when I go into a school, I don't share any personal stories or experiences that have to do with sex, sexuality, or sexual health, even if I get asked about it, because that's not my role in that space. It's okay, though, to share as much as you want with the people who are young people in your life. If you are, you know, a parent, a guardian, a family member, there are different, certainly, things than in the education space. Get them talking as much as possible, or keep asking questions until they give you a little bit more. I know that can be hard because they might be like, I'm going to only give you one-word answers, but it does allow for hopefully more to come from them. So use that space. So as far as barriers go, some tips for overcoming them: try to recognize your barriers, learn as much as you can, use resources. Generally, nervousness is a lack of feeling informed about a topic or how to talk about a topic. There are lots of resources. Like I said, I will share some at the end or in the follow-up email for your attendance here. Use resources, but also just be kind to yourself. I've stressed it, but some of the conversations will not go well. It doesn't mean the effort's gone fully unnoticed by the young person. They will see that someone wants to engage them, and maybe that just opens the door enough for them to come looking for that information the next time. And you can also let them know why you want to have the conversations. Let them know your values around why you think it's important to talk about healthy relationships, why you want to talk to them about different things that may be tough to discuss. Again, by having the conversations, even though it's not relevant to the young person, it might be relevant later. Talking about dating, healthy relationships, birth control, any of these topics may not be necessary now because a young person might be years away from wanting to date anyone, but they will have those conversations in their mind as they think about what they want from a healthy relationship, as an example. So it sets that foundation for them to be prepared for things. Now, the other way that these conversations tend to happen, aside from some of the practices we just talked about to sort of start the conversation, they tend to be based around a young person asking a question. So how can you be prepared for that? A few guidelines are validate. We already said that. For the other, clarify and confirm. Find a starting point. So that basically just means, what do you already know that you feel confident sharing? Following up, that's that getting clarity, continuing. And then, it's always a great idea if it's a topic that's just a lot of information, if it's less values-based, just looking up together goes a long way. So as an example, let's say a 9-year-old asks, is masturbation bad? Very common question about, as someone is experiencing going through puberty, they might be experiencing new types of things. So 9 to 12 generally is when someone starts to experience some level of sexual arousal within their own body. So that doesn't mean they want to engage in sexual activity in any way, but being aware and thinking about and experiencing parts of their body change. Now, if we think about validating these steps, great question, appreciate you asking. It's all right to take time to collect your thoughts. I think that generally it can be tough because we want to be able to give an answer really quickly, because we want to, either we're excited for the conversation because we're glad the young person came to us, or because we're maybe a little nervous, so we want to just get the words out. It's okay to take some time, ask for some time, say, I'll get back to you in a little bit, or tomorrow, let's talk about it. Maybe it's a question in the car and you don't want to answer it in the car, or it's in the supermarket. It's okay to say, let's come back to it. The key though is, of course, to come back to it so that the young person knows you will be that resource who's not going to tell them, oh, we'll talk about it later, and then it never gets discussed. Clarify and confirm. What often happens when young people ask questions is adults interpret it through our adult lens. And that means we assume things about what they're actually asking that we can really consider and think, what is the young person looking for? What do they want? It's that sense of, what do we give them all the information, or can we narrow it down to what they really want to know about? So for example, this word bad can be a value. Is it wrong morally? Is it wrong? Is it permission? Are they curious about it because they would like to engage in this behavior they've heard about? Are they normal? Is it someone who is trying to decide or figure out where this fits for them? Or is it unhealthy, meaning is it going to harm them? So asking them for more clarity goes a very long way in a question like this. Starting point, provide information you know. This could be values, this could be facts, this could be anything that fits within that. It could be the open-ended question allows you to know, okay, you actually are not really sure what this is. You can let a young person know what masturbation actually is. So being aware of that, what are your values around it? What do you want to share with them will allow them to have that conversation answered. So facts, right? Masturbation is a healthy behavior. It's common. Most people do engage in masturbation at some point. That helps clarify the normalcy of it for a young person. But then also values for yourself. It could look very different than our mock answer here of it should happen in private. It's nothing wrong with it, but someone starts changing their behavior. It might become a problem where someone is engaging in it too much for them if it's interfering with their life. So think about what values you would want to share for yourself. And then check for understanding. Is there anything else they want to know? What do they think about it? Where, what other things do they know about the term? Gives a sense of and keeps the conversation open. This is crucial because it's going to open and continue that conversation. So those steps go a long way for a young person to have that conversation. So that is one example. Again, that is a framework to use to have the conversation. Some key things as we think about it, as we hit our last few minutes here. just remember, a lot of mini talks. You don't have to be an expert. Think about the values you want to share. Learn more if you're concerned about facts, use resources or look together for resources so that you can be prepared, but also know that not every conversation will be perfect. It might take a lot of attempts to be able to go and access information and be prepared. But every time the conversation happens, it gives a young person a little more confidence that they can have conversations. And then that sets them up to have an adult who's a resource for if they really need that support system. If some of those negative elements of life do happen to a young person, they can access, or those really complicated situations, they have someone they can access. We're right here at 7. I want to honor people's time. I will stick around if there are more questions. I'm happy to answer them. But other than that, I hope you all found something you can take away from this. And I'm so glad you were able to come. We need just more and more adults who are able to have conversations about sex, sexuality, and sexual health with the young people in their lives, because you really are such important resources for those young people. So I really appreciate y'all coming. I hope that there was value in it for you. And I wish everyone a fantastic evening.